Welcome to all.
Because there's only 7 of us, we maybe can take whenever we need to ask questions or get into more of a discussion.
Okay.
One of the reasons I picked this up, happening here, my screen's not moving. Oh, there we are. There we are. The 2 questions that I'm asked the most as a retired pastor, and number 1 is, do you believe the world was created in 7 days? To which my answer is no. And do I believe in God? And I say, yes, I do. And why do you do that, given where we are with science? When we were getting ready to go down to Florida, I had several people ask me if I was going to stop by and see the Ark exhibit in Kentucky. And I made the mistake one time of laughing and saying, well, no, I wouldn't go anywhere near that exhibit. And I offended somebody because they asked why. And I said, well, it's got history all wrong. And there probably never was anyone that looked exactly like Noah with a boat and animals on it. And I found out very quickly that this person was more than a little perturbed. I was at a wedding a while back, and after the wedding was done, I had mentioned during my little sermon that, and I shared this before, was the universe was about 14 billion years old. And someone came up afterwards, and this guy gave me the biggest hug I've had in a long time, saying that he'd never heard a pastor say that the earth was, the universe was that old. And that kind of shocked me because I don't know of a pastor who doesn't believe that. So what I decided to do was take a look at it myself. And I ended up with some really, I think, interesting things. One of the things I think I found is that this issue has almost nothing to do with evolution in a technical sense. And that one of the problems is that Protestantism, or at least a significant branch of it, moves from the Bible to the 21st century and forgets that there is 2,000 years in between. And they're more interested in going back to some sort of perfect paradise or something that looks like biblical times, which I don't understand, and that they don't know anything about the history of the church between the Bible and the 21st century, and so that they lose a sense of context. So I'll just start out by saying that the National Council of Churches and the Papacy, neither one of them have any issue with evolution in terms of its ability to explain why we're here. I have one of my favorite theologians is John Haught. He's a Roman Catholic at Georgetown University, I think. And he basically says if it is, that is the church, is to survive in the intellectual climate of the day, our theological fresh expression of evolutionary terms. When we think about God in the post-Darwinian age, we cannot have exactly the same thoughts that Augustine or Aquinas or our grandparents or our parents had. Pope Francis said that evolution is not inconsistent with the notion of creation. And the president of Italy's National Institute of Astrophysics welcomed Pope Francis' statement saying that the Pope's statement was made because we are the direct descendants of the Big Bang. So most of the church actually has no, well, it might have issues with evolution, but there's no one in most of the church that would deny the evolution, and particularly neo-Darwinism. Darwin's theory is, in some sense, remarkably simple. First of all, it says that all life was formed from a common ancestor. So that means that all mammalian life and all life began at a particular time, and that we all have a common ancestor. And second, that the explanation is gradual modification, and that includes the emergence of new species by a process of natural selection. Most people have no problem with that. Natural selection means that those organisms most able to adapt to their environments will be selected by nature to survive and produce offspring. And that is called what Darwin called the descent with modification. And then you add two things to that. Number one, Malthus, Thomas Malthus, and Gregory Mendel. Malthus, after Darwin read, talked about the struggle for existence. And I can't read what I've got there now, so I take it that you can read exactly what the quote is. But basically, survival of the fittest. And then after Darwin developed his theory, for a long time, no one had a mechanism or an idea of what mechanism by which evolution would work. And it took the understanding of geneticism to come along to give us a mechanism by which the Darwinian theory might accomplish itself. And of course, that's called neo-Darwinism. One of the things I like about John F. Haught, and I just think this is important for the church to understand, is that we are not at the end of evolution, that everything is still evolving, and sometimes in different ways, because we can participate in unique ways in our continuing evolution. And we are not the top of the pyramid yet, or the bottom of the pyramid. And John Haught does this interesting thing. He says that if you had a book that was 450 pages long, and each page stood for 1 million years, the Big Bang would take place on page 1 of volume 1. And the first 21 books in this collection of books, each 450 pages long, would have nothing to do with life, but deal with the chemical, stellar, and galactic process. Our solar system would appear in volume 21 about 4.5 billion years ago. But the earliest instances of life did not show up until volume 22, about 3.8 billion years ago. And it remained single cell until the Cambrian explosion, and there's some really good books written on this. And this would happen about volume 30, and most things go extinct on page 384. Only the last 66 pages of volume 30 would feature the flourishing of mammalian life. So you have 66 books, 65 of which are 450 pages long, and we don't get to mammalians until the 66th volume. And so there is a sense in which we're extremely late. And I've got something showing here that I can't get off. Let me see if No, I can't get it off. Self-reflective subjectivity, ethical aspirations, and religious quest, it only comes in the last paragraph of the last page of the last volume. So if you had 30 volumes of 450 pages long, humanity would only come along and pay at the very last page of the 30th volume in the last paragraph. And so that gives us a sense of where we are in the evolutionary process. We are like a blink of an eye. What we think has taken thousands of years in terms of the billions of years of the universe, we haven't been here but a split second. And the other interesting question, I think, is, okay, are we still evolving? Is the universe still evolving? Or is it devolving? And most things that I read says it could go either way. We can devolve. We can also evolve. And the big question is, are we headed anywhere? In other words, is there any point to evolution at all? Are we somehow intended byproducts, or are we accidental byproducts which have no meaning or no purpose except what we give it while we are here? And so one of the questions I think the church needs to ask is, where are we on the process of evolution, and how is the church evolving? And how is our understanding of God evolving? And we're not, what will we look like 1,000 years from now? I mean, could you imagine 1,000 years back in 1821 saying, what would it be like 100 years in the future, let alone 1,000? And I can't believe where we are now from what I knew in 1950. And we've just changed so much, evolved in our understanding, just such a huge amount, that we don't live in the same world that our grandparents lived in. And for some reason, the conservative church, or the fundamentalist church in particular, has a problem with evolution. And one of the questions I would like to ask them is, okay, why don't you have any problem with any of the other issues in the Bible that says, for example, like sun revolves around the earth rather than the earth around the sun, that the earth is set on 4 pillars and it is flat. For some reason, they don't say that the Bible is scientifically true for that, and that if you believe in the Bible, you got to believe in a flat earth and a sun that revolves around the earth. But for some reason, when it comes to evolution, you say, well, the Bible's got to be literally scientifically true for that, which is just not logically or philosophically makes any sense at all. So the question I had is, why is evolution such a problem for the church? And I've come to the conclusion that I don't think it is. As a matter of fact, not only don't I think it is, I think we have missed the whole issue around evolution, and I'd like to share that with you, and hopefully we can have some discussion. That what's important for us to understand that there's 2 kinds of language that we're going to be dealing with. One is descriptive, and that is evolution as a descriptive enterprise. Does it describe accurately the process by which we are here? And so that is an external, provable, scientific issue, which can be true or false, and we may find sometime in the future that it has to be modified again or even changed. But right now, it seems to be the best explanation that we have for why we are here. And that is a descriptive thing. The other thing that we get confused is prescriptive language. In other words, what does that mean in terms of what we think about life and the values that we have? An expert in genetics and in evolution, like Richard Dawkins, who I accept 98% of what he says when it comes to his description. His book on the selfish gene and other books are really fascinating, interesting books. I can't debate with him. He knows far more than I know. However, just because he's an expert at descriptive understanding of evolution does not mean that he's an expert in prescriptive language and evolution. In other words, what is the meaning of evolution? And he moves sometimes from one descriptive to prescriptive and commits all sorts of logical fallacies. And I think that issue is the one that gives the church the most problem. Very simple. We have if-then statements. If evolution is true, and then you have a description that comes after it. For example, if evolution is true, if all living things evolved, if all mammals evolved, and humans are mammals, therefore humans evolved. That's a fairly descriptive statement where the premises and the conclusion are all contained fairly much in the statement. If all the prepositions are true, or premises, then the conclusion is true. All living things evolved, all mammals evolved, humans are mammals, therefore humans evolved. That's a very descriptive statement. On the other hand, if you said evolution is true, all living things evolved, all mammals evolved, all humans are mammals, and humans evolved, therefore God does not exist. You understand what I'm saying? You've moved from a descriptive to a prescriptive, and you've moved from something that is logically coherent to something that is logically incoherent, where your conclusion does not rest in the presuppositions that led to the conclusion. For example, it could also be if evolution is true and the fittest survive, then eugenics is justified. And so we have to ask ourselves what kind of things are going on. So I spent a fair amount of time looking at the Scopes trial, and particularly one book. And Kenneth Miller, in his book, Finding Darwin's God, realized something when he was talking to a person about evolution and the effects of evolution. He said, drawing back in his chair to the effect of an air of wisdom earned by many years, my senior, I don't know about this evolution stuff, but I do like to think that we are put here for a reason, don't you? And his issue is not with evolution. He doesn't even know what evolution is. His problem is that he's afraid that if you accept evolution, what it means is we have no purpose in our lives. And he doesn't want to live a purposeless life. And so he goes back and says, I can't accept evolution because I believe if I accept evolution, I therefore have to live without any purpose. The must-read book is the Pulitzer Prize history, Summer for the Gods, a story of the Scopes trial. I've had that on my bookshelf for years, and one of the reasons I'm doing this is I had to have an excuse to finally pull it off and read it, and I found it an extremely exciting book. Edward Larson's, for example, when Scopes was, the trial was beginning, many Americans associated Darwinian natural selection as it applied to people with the survival of the fittest mentality that justified laissez-faire capitalism and imperialism and militarism. And what I found interesting, it was in a large part liberals who opposed the theory of evolution, not because of the theory of evolution itself, but because of the conclusions that were being drawn by it. So peace advocates were upset because survival of the fittest seemed to indicate that the person who is the strongest would survive, and war, especially the First World War, at least in some quarters, was being described as a survival of the fittest. That this is what the results of Darwinian evolution meant. And then Andrew Carnegie and John D. Rockefeller, in their writings, said decades before that the reason you want capitalism and some people to rise to the top and control it is because it is a sign of Darwinian evolution is true. And so there were people who were involved in social justice issues who were saying, how do we fight the fact that if evolution is true, then the best rise to the top, or the fittest, or the strongest, and therefore we have to accept war, and we have to accept this stratification of society where only the best arrive. And like I said, I have no trouble with a lot of things that Dawkins says about evolution. It's when he moves and he says, this is one of the hardest lessons for humans to learn. We cannot admit that things may be neither good nor evil, neither cruel or kind, but simply callous, indifferent to all, suffering, lacking all purpose. He says this over and over again in many different ways, but he basically says, because I believe in evolution, I believe there is absolutely no purpose in life except the purpose that I happen to give it, and that there is no good, right, or wrong. Well, if that's true, you have to move to kind of some, I guess, social contract theory of ethics. But if there is no good or evil, how do you combat what happened in Germany with the extermination of not only Jews, but Catholics and mentally retarded and gays and all of that, which were based on a fact that if there is neither good nor evil, and there's neither cruel nor kind, what kind of world does that leave you with? So the question I have for Dawkins would be, not is evolution true, but as a descriptive thing, we can agree with it. But does he have the information to move to the next step and make a prescriptive statement about the quality of the life we have? Does it necessarily follow that if evolution is true, there is neither good nor evil, cruel or kind, but simply callous, indifferent to all, suffering, lacking all purpose? Is that necessarily follow the statement that evolution is descriptive? I can't read the one on my right. I probably should figure out a way of dealing with that, but I'll just let you take a look at that and understand. I think it would be clear what that means. Christopher Hitchens, another one of supporters of evolution, one of the great atheists of our day. We keep on being told that religion, whatever its imperfections, at least instills morality. On every side, there is conclusive evidence that contrary is the case, and that faith causes people to be more mean, more selfish, and perhaps above all, more stupid. Well, there are some of us, people of faith, who might take umbrage to being called stupid, which reminds me of somebody in Washington who, when you haven't got a decent argument, you call names. I mean, that is just such a bad argument that it doesn't even probably deserves talking about. But he says, I'm not even an atheist. He's an anti-theist. And one of the things he argues is because evolution is true, it automatically means you have to be an anti-theist. You have to believe that religion is of evil. And it doesn't take seriously that religion is evolving. That one of the reasons some of that evil has come out of religion is the fact that it is itself still in the process of evolution. It has not arrived at any final peak, and that the Christianity 100 years, 1,000 years, we might have new religions 2,000 years from now. We don't know how this evolution is going to take place. An image I use is we're like the midway through building a cathedral that takes 500 years to build. When that first person laid the block of the cathedral, say it takes 500 years to complete, knows that it will never see the completed cathedral. And the person in between at year 250 has an idea of where that cathedral is going, but still will not live to see the finishing of the cathedral, the evolving of the process of the cathedral being completed. And there may have been a lot of mistakes made along the way as they learn how to build a cathedral. So we don't always know where we are headed, but the great question for evolution, I think, and one that I don't have an answer for, but I think the one that we need to discuss is there a teleology to it? In other words, is there a purpose to evolution? Are we evolving into something? Is there a goal to evolution? And I don't think I'm myself ready to, I have some ideas, but propelled by the anti-evolution crusade, there is something that happened in the Scopes trial that is still with us today that was developed mainly by Bryan in the courtroom to a great extent, and that was majoritarianism. And that is, how do you determine what to teach in public schools? And so the debate, a lot of the debate in the courtroom revolved around majoritarianism. Try and say that 10 times quickly. And what it meant was, he who pays determines. In other words, who determines what is taught in the classroom? And there were a lot of people who were majoritarianism, which said the schools must teach what the taxpayers who pay for it desire to be taught. And so the argument was not whether evolution was right or wrong, but a big part of the evolution is this what we want taught our children? And so the thing is, what control does the majority have over what is taught? And you can find that same argument today in the 21st century when people say, I pay taxes and I don't want that taught in school. Well, there's no issue here about what's right or wrong. How do we know whether evolution is correct or incorrect, how it should be taught? Simply, if the majority of people who may not understand evolution at all, and they admitted that in the Scopes trial, that the issue was not about evolution, but that they didn't want evolution taught because they didn't want the results, the moral results of evolution, or what was being taught was the moral results of evolution, which was the First World War, the stronger survive, the weaker die. And so a majority ought to simply be able to say, we don't want that taught. And so that raises, I think, an extremely interesting question. What I didn't realize was that the textbook, and here's a copy of the textbook. I hope you can read that because, gee, I really want to read this. I want to see if I can get this out of here. No. What happened in the textbook is one of the leaders in eugenics wrote a section of the evolutionary thing, and in it, it said that one of the things that we want to do is teach evolution so we can stress the importance of eugenics and particularly proper mating so that we can, in some ways, control who gets born and who gets married. And I want to give you an example of this. I had a parishioner here in Alpena who's been deceased now for several years. So I think I can tell this story. When I went to call on her about 15, 20 years ago, was very upset and said she needed to share something with me. And I asked her what that was, and she said she wasn't married because she had epilepsy. And I looked at her and I said, "What?" And she said, "Well, when I fell in love and went to get married," and I forget whether this was Wisconsin or Minnesota, it was one of those two states, there was a rule that epileptics could not marry. That's a eugenic issue. And so people were, some people were strongly opposed to this particular textbook because it thought that it pushed the issue of eugenics, which was tied to evolution. And when I was writing my master's thesis on the rise of Hitler, one of the things that, one of not many, that the Nazis used was studies in Columbia University in New York and Stanford in California that talked about eugenics. And they thought that that was the way to help them buttress their case for genocide. And so this issue was not simply about is evolution right or wrong? It was, what are the moral implications of evolution? And do you want in a textbook something that says, if evolution is true, we need to do that so that we can move forward with eugenics? Are those two tied together? In other words, if, go back there, if evolution is true, does it mean then eugenics naturally follow? I don't think so. But that was one of the issues I didn't realize was the really, really big issue in this trial. Larson writes, by 1935, 35 states enacted laws to compel the sexual segregation and sterilization of certain persons viewed as eugenically unfit, particularly the mentally ill and retarded, habitual criminals, and notice that, epileptics. Hunter, who wrote that section in that textbook, in the Scopes trial, said, if such people were lower animals, we would probably kill them off to prevent them from spreading. And so you have in the 20s and 30s this tie-in between evolution and eugenics. And then you'll notice, and again, I can't read what's on that side, I'm sorry, but the idea that this is why we have asylums, and this is why we prevent intermarriage, and we don't want to perpetuate a degenerate race, whatever that is. And you can see that there are some really significant moral issues that were in that textbook. Whether you accept evolution or not, the question is, do you move from description to prescription, and how do you justify moving from description the prescription. And just because you're describing it right doesn't mean that your prescription is right. Just because you accept evolution doesn't mean that that therefore means that you should move forward with eugenics. In the 30s, 35 states, as it says here, were improving the human race by better hereditary. And so we had in the United States, at least being used as a justification, blacks unable to marry whites, people who are mentally ill not being able to marry, people who have epileptics not being able to, and so that whole question of the survival of the fittest. I'm not at this time trying to give an exact answer to that, but I'm saying that the issues around evolution mostly were not whether evolution was true or not, but if it was true, what were the ramifications of it. E.A. Wiggins, a geneticist, said he recognized the tie between eugenics and evolution and helped change history. He lamented, until we can convince the common man of the fact of evolution, I fear we cannot convince him of the profound ethical and religious significance of the thing we call eugenics. So I think there's a difference between saying, I don't want evolution taught because I don't want eugenics taught. Does the one necessarily mean the other? And how far can you push the teaching of evolution in terms if, for example, Dawkins says there is no good, there is no evil, there is no right, there is no wrong, there is no pain, there is no suffering, that all of that is up for grabs, then how do you react to that? I'm in favor of teaching evolution. I'm also in favor of saying we ought to have the discussion about prescription. In other words, what evolution means to us. What are the ethical implications? But we shouldn't depend on somebody who knows nothing about teaching ethics. And Dawkins, as smart as he is in genetics and in evolution and all of that sort of stuff, his understanding of religion is very childish and immature. People who read his work, including myself, read it and say, I don't disagree with his comments about religion, because the religion he's talking about is not a religion that I know. It would be like me trying to talk about genetics. I can know enough so I can say, yeah, I think genetics sounds like it's good, but I could never argue with Dawkins about genetics. And as a layperson, I don't think I have any need to. I have a need to understand genetics as best I can. But just because you're an expert in one field does not mean you're an expert in another. For example, William Jennings Bryan, as a devout believer in peace, Bryan could scarcely understand how supposedly Christian nations could engage in such a brutal war until two scholarly books attributed to misguided Darwinian thinking. Again, the issue is not whether Darwin was right or evolution is right. It was that there were these books that were being published and about how the reason we're at war is because it's part of the evolutionary process. And Bryan was a peacenik. He was very much opposed to war. Headquarters night at Stanford's zoologist Vernon Kellogg and science that's the name of it, Headquarters Night by Stanford zoologist Vernon Kellogg and Science of Power by philosopher Benjamin Kidd. Both books found a link between German militarism and Darwinian thinking. This led many liberal peace activists to condemn Darwinian thought, not scientifically, but its resulting morality. Natural selection would therefore call this fatal competitive structure, and Darwin greatly influenced Nietzsche, and so the questions somehow got tied into saying, should we teach evolution, which I think misses the issue almost entirely. James H. Luba wrote a book, The Belief in God and Immortality. And one of the things he found, and this is just a fact, and I don't think there's anything wrong with stating this fact, is that the more you know about evolution, the less religious you are. And that was true when he wrote the book, and it is true to this day. And I think it is partly true because we have not had the conversation I'm talking about of accepting evolution, or at least the broad outline of it, and saying, are these other things the necessary theological, ethical conclusions if you accept, for example, evolution? Does that mean you should be an atheist? Does it mean that might makes right? Well, we've discussed some of those and decided some of them, but not all of them. The other thing that happened just at the time of the Scopes trial was that higher criticism in Germany was really becoming tremendously influential in the United States. And that is higher criticism of the Bible. People looking at the Bible as a product of the church, looking at the Bible and saying, no, that's the Bible is not correct there in a scientific sense, that these books are written by different people over different times, they have different historical contexts. For example, Genesis 1 was written about 500 BC, Genesis 2 was about 1000 BC, so you got two creation stories, probably came around about 500 years difference between them. And so the church got in this tremendous argument about, is the Bible true or not? And so that came along at exactly the same time that the Scopes trial came along. And so modernism, or modernism in Christianity, gets tied in with evolution. The finality of higher criticism, or the theology of evolution and false theology. Notice the title of that book. The finality of higher criticism. Fundamentalism basically came along to fight modernism and higher criticism in the church. And then it got tied in with evolution. 1919, during an interdenominational battle within the Northern Baptist Church, conservative leaders coined the term for the first time, fundamentalists. Fundamentalism is a very, very new movement within the church. And this is a time when the church was really wrestling with a lot of internal things about how to treat the Bible. And you'll see the steps here, that the further you go down modernism and higher criticism, the closer you get to atheism and the closer you get to evolution. Now, I'd like to a couple more slides and I'll take a break. We got a lot more to go, but we'll take a break, see if anyone is making any sense. In origin, one of the things I mentioned earlier is, I think the problem with the Protestant church, and which one of the reasons why we need Roman Catholicism, is because it maintains the historical narrative better than most Protestants. Not all. I studied all this in summary, but we need to understand that things have changed. for example, when they say, well, the Bible is literally true in Genesis. Well, in AD 225, not exactly a modern scholar, Origen, one of the patristic writers of the early church, for who that understanding will suppose that the first and second and third day existed without a sun and moon and stars, and that the first day was, as it were, also without a sky, I do not suppose that anyone doubts that these things figuratively indicate certain mysteries, the history having taken place in appearance and not literally. Now that's in 225 AD. This is not a modernist scholarship. The whole idea that we have with MAGA, Make America Great Again, this idea of going backwards is just so, I don't know, it's destructive. You can't go back. And when you get back there, you'll find out that what you thought was such a great time probably wasn't. I mean, I wouldn't want to go back to the 50s. I had a parishioner who was a physician, helped found Bon Secours Hospital down near Detroit. And they were losing people when he was a physician in World War I because of, they couldn't, if a person had appendicitis, they couldn't do operating on him on board ship. And they would just let the person, well, not just let the person die, there was no way they could deal with it. I don't want to go back to pre-vaccination for polio days. And I also don't want to go back to the ethical understandings of race relations in the 1950s and 60s. Going back is just doesn't make any sense. Now, what I'd like to do is spend some time here, and then we'll take a break. When I teach Old Testament and we look at Genesis, on the first day we look at Genesis, what I ask people to do is do me a favor. Would you please read Genesis 1 to Genesis 2:4a? That's in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And I want you to draw me the picture that is created when you read that. Don't tell me whether you believe it or don't believe it. Draw the picture of what it is creating. And what you get is the picture you see on your screen now. You get a sense in which there are waters above the earth. There's a firmament, and there are floodgates that allow water in, that there is the earth, there's shale on the bottom, and that there are columns that hold up the earth. And so I simply ask people, okay, if you accept Genesis 1 as true, in what way is it true? Is this the way you understand the earth to be? You can see the moon there. And you can see the sun over here and the stars and the water and shale and the pillars of the earth and the water above. Is that the way you look at the world? Do you think this is the way we as Christians today ought to understand how the world was created in a scientific and literal sense? And people usually step back and say, no, they had never taken time to think about what the earth would look like if it was created that way. And so the issue then becomes, what message do you get from Genesis? And so St. Augustine said, I not infrequently happens that something about the earth, about the sky, about other elements of this world, about the motion and rotation, or even the magnitude and distance of the stars, about definite eclipses, the sun and the moon, about the passage of years, about the nature of animals, and I'll move down a little bit. It is too disgraceful, ruinous, though, and greatly to be avoided, that the non-Christian should hear a Christian speaking so idiotically on those matters as if in accord with Christian writings, that he might say that he could scarcely keep from laughing when he saw how totally in error they are. In view of this, and in keeping it in mind constantly while dealing with the book. This is Augustine in the 4th century, saying that you can't take Genesis literally, and that there are some scientific things that you need to look at. I'm going to take a break here. Are there any, is this, number one, making any sense? And number two, do you have any comments? Take a cup of coffee.
Harold, you started out by saying most of the church did not have a problem with evolution.
Yes.
And when you say that, are you talking about just the Christian church? And, you know, in most, what does that mean? 80% or?
Well, let me put it this way. Yes, I'm talking about the Christian church. I make no idea that that of what other churches teach or what other religions and other faiths teach. I say most because the Pope Francis, Pope John Paul II, and in encyclicals, and I believe in the Catholic Catechism, I read that, but that was a long time ago, basically says they have no problem with evolution in terms of being true. And if you say that, you take in almost all of Christendom. I mean, how many billion, was there a billion Roman Catholics? I don't know. It's a huge number. So already you've got a base of a huge number of Christians. If you look at what's being taught in mainline churches, Presbyterian, Episcopalian, United Church of Christ, evangelical Lutheran churches, at their seminaries, I think you would find people who would strongly debate the prescriptions that come out of evolution, but I don't think you would find a single Old Testament professor teaching that the world was created in 7 days, was 6,000 years old. I don't think you'd find that at all. Where you would find it would be in fundamentalist Bible schools, which again basically moved from the Bible of 2000. Well, actually, we didn't have a Bible until 350 AD, but put that aside. They go back and they take the Bible and they pull it up and then they drop it down in the 21st century and say you have to believe it exactly like it is. And so that God created the world in 7 days, even though there's a second creation story right after that, which is in contradiction to the first one. So when I say most, I don't know whether it's 80%, but if you take Roman Catholicism, if you take Greek Orthodoxy, Orthodox movement, and if you take mainline Protestantism, I say it's got to be 75, 80%, maybe less if you take just the United States because of the size of the fundamentalist churches in the United States. So it might be less there. And I'm talking about the official teaching. I'm not talking about an individual Catholic or Congregationalist who might believe the world was created in 6 days. I'm talking about the general teaching of the church. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah. Any other comments, questions?
Well,
Hello?
have you read the New Scientific American, June? One of the articles is a planet is born, and with their instruments now, they're able to look at stars that have disk around it and watch the formation of different planets, and some of them that it sort of gives you an understanding of the world, or how things go about forming, and you know, look at the world and try to understand it. And religion is just one of the factors that influence you in terms of how things would be. One of the things I think our nervous system always tries to do is to observe what's going on around us and then try to make some sense out of it for us to help us live in that situation. And this is, I think, just a article that shows one phase of that, just like we look at all of the other things within our society and whatnot, and try to understand, yeah, and how we might get by here. And I think this is what problem that you're and we're dealing with right now when you talk about the morality and whatnot, that is the human I can't say brain, human nervous system is trying to make some sense out of the world. And
and I think you raised the central question: is there meaning in the world that we can discover? Excuse me, my friendly cat just came here up on top. Is there a teleology? Is there a purpose? Is there something, for example, that is absolutely wrong about genocide? And if there is, how do you find that? And is it rooted in anything that transcends us? I think those are the questions and the debates that need to be had. And as long as we argue about whether evolution is true or not in the church, we're missing the essential debate that I think you raised. I like to go back to Augustine. And now remember, we're talking about the 4th century. This is not modern, so he's not a scientist by any means. He says, Scripture has stated that the earth brought forth the crops and the trees causally, in the sense that it received the power of bringing them forth. God created what was to be in times to come in the earth from the beginning, and what I might call the roots of time. God must be thought of as creating in that very first moment the potencies for all the kinds of living things that would come later, including humanity. What I want to say here is what even Augustine in the 4th century is saying: the world was not created all at once. Humanity just didn't all of a sudden pop up on the earth. That even just looking at the Bible, it is clear to him that living things would come forth later. Now that's certainly not Darwinian evolution, and it's certainly not what we would call scientific today. But what Alistair McGrath says is, and he's a macrobiologist and a clergy person, a PhD and teaches at Cambridge, says that if you look at this, you can see that the literal interpretation of Genesis is not necessarily rooted in the church. That there has always been interpretation, and Augustine is saying, yes, things evolved. God started them off, okay? But then things evolved, and one thing came after the other. So you don't have to have creation in 6 days or 7 days, and this, and this. It's just not done. The other great person that I think, by the way, the Dominican, St. Thomas Aquinas, he did something that has stuck with the church for a long time, and then kind of got lost, I think, by some branches of the church. Aquinas sees reason and faith as two ways of knowing. He's the one who brought Aristotle, certainly was not a Christian, who was accepted finally as kind of the authority by secular and religious people in the 11th, 12th, 13th century. He kind of brought it into the church. And he said there are two ways of seeing things. The first way of knowing is reason. And reason covers what we can know by experience and logic alone. In other words, he says every human being, and by their experience and by logic and with reason, can know a lot. You don't have to be a Christian. He even says that from reason alone, you can know that there is a God and that there is only one God. Now, you could have, what's interesting is that from that premise, you could have debates with Christians and non-Christians, and even within the Christian church, is there a logical, reasonable reason for believing in God? But then he said, these truths about God are accessible by anyone by experience and logic alone, apart from any special revelation to God. In other words, we need to use our reasonable faculties and our logic and our experience to put together the world. I'll give you a brief story. This is an apocryphal story, by the way. There's a story told of Haught, who is a process theologian. I think he's deceased now. And he asked his class, at the beginning of class, how many of you believe that God exists? And in this philosophy class, the story goes that no one raised their hand. So he then went through the ontological proof for the existence of God, which we don't have to know anything about. But the story goes that he started on one side on the blackboard. And I had a professor, by the way, who used to do this kind of stuff. And he put logical notation all down one side, all down the front board, and then all down the board on the other side, trying to prove by the ontological proof for the existence of God that God existed. And so when he had finished, he asked the class, how many of you believe in God? And slowly, one person raised their hand, then a second person, and pretty soon the entire class had their hand up that they believed that God existed. And then Hartshorne said to them, how many of you believe in God? And no one raised their hand. There's a difference between believing that God exists and believing in God. And so what Thomas says is you have to distinguish between philosophy and theology. There are different starting points. Philosophy is the premise is open to all through reason. Theology, the premise is open to those who held to be true on the basis of faith. And so there are two ways of knowing. There is the way of faith, of spiritual experience, of understanding, reading of scripture. There's also a completely reasonable and rational understanding that can be, anybody can understand. And so it isn't like the only thing you know has to be in the Bible, or the only thing you know about creation has to be in Genesis 1 and 2. John Calvin, not exactly a liberal by any means. He says in his commentary on Genesis, nothing is here treated but the visible form of the world. He who would learn astronomy and other recondite arts, let him go elsewhere. In other words, you can't play baseball on a football field. You have to know what field you're on and what the rules are in order to play the game. And that using the Bible to study astronomy just doesn't make any sense. If you want to understand astronomy, fine, go study astronomy. If you want to understand Genesis, fine, understand Genesis. But Genesis is not going to give you the answers to the questions that you have about astronomy. Are there any questions or comments? Boy. Okay. Just something about Genesis 1. Genesis 1 is written like, it's called the priestly code. It's written in a responsorial form, like you might if you went to church and the priest would say something and then the people would respond. And so you get the response, then God said, let there be light, and there was light. And God saw that the light was good. And it was evening and it was morning of the first day, and God saw it. Notice also that when creation of male and female comes, it says God created them male and female. He created them. He didn't create Adam first and then woman. It is a statement that men and women are created equally by God. Male and female, God created them. God blessed them and said to them, be fruitful and multiply. He didn't say something to a person called Adam and then something to a person called Eve. He was talking to both of them. And he found out that humanity was very good. And so what this is a radical creation story when put up against the Babylonian creation story, which was the premier creation story at that time, and also the other creation stories around the Mediterranean area that were by the Phoenicians, and everyone had their creation myths. All of those stories were the world was created out of battles, big fights, gods being cut in two, Marduk wielding his sword, and the blood being spilled, and then the earth is created, and the god has a consort, a woman. They're male gods and female gods. All of a sudden, you have this. There are three things actually, I think, that were astounding to people of that day. And it wasn't that the world was created in 6 days. It was, number one, that it was created good. It was not created out of war. It was created in a peaceful manner, out of being spoken. And that it was named over and over again as being good. It was not deficient. It was not broken. It was something, this world is a good world. That's one reason why in Christianity we can study science and so on, because this is a good world. I mean, this is created and it's there. We can study it. And the other thing that really hurt, particularly when they went into so-called promised land, was that this God wasn't married. And so the early Hebrews in the promised land were considered to be atheists. And the reason they were atheists was because they didn't believe in a female God, and they didn't believe in the water, which was the sperm falling on the egg, which was the earth. And farmers were worried that crops wouldn't grow because rituals weren't performed. And so the radicalness of Genesis 1 has nothing to do with creation 6 days and everything to do with a monotheistic, peaceful creation, which is good, and which is set over against a polytheistic world. I'm not going to argue right or wrong with that. I'm just saying that I think historically that can be demonstrated. Genesis 2 is, of course, the story of Adam and Eve. And I've said before, what we really need to understand is that the word for earth is Hadam, and the word for Adam is Adama, or is it the other way around? But anyways, we don't realize that in Hebrew what we're saying is out of the earth person comes, that there is a tie-in, that we are part of the physical universe. And that again, this world is created good, and so you have to talk about where did evil come from? And so you find across the Mediterranean, in fact, you see it around the world, if you study the history of religions, there are stories about the world is created and you can do everything, but you can't take that one canoe, or you can't climb that mountain, or you can't eat of that tree. Something happens inside of us that creates brokenness or a sense of incompleteness. And what Haught says is that's because there never was a Garden of Eden exactly like that. That we all have come and we are all learning and we are moving toward a wholeness. And that wholeness is like a growing symphony. And that we have only been here in a blink of an eye. And that the process of evolving our understanding of the world, our understanding of the sacred, our understanding of the profane, to think that we've got it all wrapped up is just not so, because it's still emerging, and that's the whole theory of emergence that is happening. And so you have this other creation story, which is about 1,000 years old, and it's written, and if you read it, I like the one whose priestly code, which is responsive reading. This one is written like a story you tell around the campfire to your children. In the day that the Lord God made the earth and the heavens, when no plant of the field was yet on the earth, and no herb of the field had sprung up, the Lord God had not caused it to rain. And so you have it in a very story format. And its point is that this, why is it that we suffer? Why is it that we have problems? And these are people gripping the same issues that we try to grip today. Why do we die? Why is there COVID-19? Why is there Auschwitz? Why is there this hatred between races? Why are we so broken? And what people will say is that's because we weren't all created instantaneously. We are still in a creation that is becoming whole. And we actually don't know what that wholeness may be. My statement of faith is not that God created the world in 6 days or 7 days or whatever. My statement of faith is that I believe that creation is moving toward a wholeness. And that's a statement of faith. Somebody says that they believe there is no purpose in life. That's a statement of faith. I don't think that person can prove that any more than I can prove ultimately that there is a purpose and an overall meaning to life. My religious experience, my intellectual experience, my personal experiences leads me to think that life is with purpose and with meaning and is worthwhile and is intrinsically important and has meaning. Some people feel just the opposite. I'd be glad to sit down and talk sometime at length because I think you need to have a long conversation, not just state your position and walk away. But so the faith is in the sense that, yes, I do believe there was a Big Bang. Well, actually, I don't think it was a Big Bang, big expansion. And we're still finding out about dark matter and dark energy. And we have no idea about what we're going to find out over the next 100,000 years. But I'm like that. I try to think of myself as that faithful builder who's putting one block into that cathedral that I will never see built. I've got one more section to do quickly, but first, is there any comments? I can't believe that. Are we still there? Hello?
Yeah, still here.
Okay.
Your microphones are muted. Just give me a second. Your microphones are muted. You can, you hit the space bar, you can temporarily unmute. You have something to say. Forgot to mention that earlier.
Okay. Well, the next one is, there is a thing about random selection. And even Dawkins recently has written that random selection will not work. He's had to revise his understanding of natural selection by chance. And I'm really, this is where I begin to feel, I'm intrigued, but I certainly don't consider myself particularly knowledgeable. The question is, what are the odds of something happening? And if you roll a die, you know that the odds are 1 in 6 that a number will come up. Because it is finite, it has to be no less than 1 and no more than 6. If I roll 2 die, if I roll the dice, it cannot be less than 2, nor can it be more than 12. If I roll 3 dice, well, you get the idea. There are always a field of possibilities. They are not ever completely infinite. And you can also take a look at what are the odds of flipping a penny. And we all know that it's, if you flip it, heads and tails, it's 1 in 2. If you flip it again, it's 1 in 2. If you flip it again, it's always 1 in 2, right? So what happens is when you do that, everyone would say, okay, you flipped heads 3 times in a row, no big deal. You flipped heads 12 times in a row. It's a bigger deal, but maybe not that big a deal. You flip heads 150 times in a row, and you're saying, have you got a weighted penny, or it just doesn't seem that you get to a point where it no longer seems possible that by random you could do that. And so this is what is called factorial. So for example, if I were to drop 5 books out of a bookcase, and they fall on the floor. Well, let's say 3 books. If you'll notice on the screen, what are the odds of me randomly picking up those 3 books and putting them together? Well, that's a factorial formula of 1 times 2 times 3. So 1 in 6, about the same as rolling a die, and I'll put them in the same. What if I have 4 books? What are the odds of me automatically picking up that? Well, it would be 1 times 2 times 3 times 4, or 1 in 24. In other words, if I did that 24 times, statistically the odds are that 1 time I would do it. Well, what if I had 5 books that fell down? It would be 1 in 120 times. And you see with factorials, as you begin to look at this, the odds really begin to increase. if I had 12 books, it would be formula n, 1 times 2 times 3 times 4 times n. So it would be 12 would be 1 times 2 times 3 times 4 times 12, or it would be 479,001,601. I could do that. And that's with just 12 books, that I could do that purely by random. Now, what you see on your right-hand screen is something I copied out of a book, and believe me, I know there's some things that are wrong with it, but it is the, at least it's my right hand, the zeros and ones, zeros and one. That is the opening of the Constitution of the United States in binary language. And you can take a look at that, and you can see with a 0 and 1, if you wanted A, I'm not sure, a blank would be 0, 0, 0, 0. And you might then do A as 0, 0, 0, 1, and then B as 0, 0, 0, 1, 1. And you could work out a 26-letter alphabet, and that's how you could program a computer or something. And that's like the English language, but in some sort of binomial system. And I'm sure I made a mistake because all those zeros and ones ran together, but you get the idea. On the left side is a very, very, very short, extremely short string of genetic code. And you can see that the similarity between this. And what that means is that there is information contained within those statements. In other words, on the 0 ones, there is information. We may not have right now the ability to translate that, but if we had a code book or ran it through a computer, and if I did it right, we'd say, oh, okay, that's what it means. It could be dots and dashes. It could be a whole range of things, but it's just the same as the opening words. The same thing is true over here. Now the problem is, what are the odds of it randomly coming together? In other words, if I had if I had a monkey who we say, well, if we had an infinite number of monkeys with an infinite amount of time, they would put together Shakespeare's Hamlet. Well, that may be true, but they have a monkey program which duplicates a monkey typing one letter a second, and they have programmed it that way, and so that they can take a look at it. And the fact of the matter is, there isn't enough time in the created universe right now for that monkey to get out hardly one sentence, let alone an entire paragraph or a chapter. It is statistically impossible. And the reason, this fellow says, his name is Simon Conway Morris, and he is a genetic paleontologist at Cambridge University. And what he has come up with is something that he talks about convergence. And what he has looked at statistically, and he and Dawkins have had some interesting conversations, is that there are empty spaces. In other words, everything that we do in this world is not infinite. It has a certain amount of probability. And what, as he as a paleobiologist looks at things, he says he notices that some things continue to converge. In other words, I've got an elbow. Well, if you look in evolution, everything that ends up with an arm has something that acts like an elbow, even if it isn't. And he can go back genetically, following the genetic code back, and he says, it seems like it would be inevitable that an elbow would be evolved. It would be inevitable that an eye would be involved. Now, it might be a different kind of eye, but he takes, for example, whether you're a mollusk or whether you're a mammal or whether you're, a bird or a fish. It seems like in the world, in order to operate, somehow over the period of time in evolution, eyes will evolve. And that's what he calls a sense of convergence. And because eyes will evolve, there are blank spaces where nothing happens. So it's not totally random. You have to have some way of seeing. Now, it might be echo. It might be, and you take a look at our eyes, we see within a very narrow spectrum of visible light. Well, that spectrum might be higher, it might be lower. And if it was higher or lower, we'd see a different world than we see now. We would hear, but would we hear exactly the same range of vibrations? Probably not. But it seems, he says, that there are certain things that converge. And so evolution is a form of emergence, that things are emerging out as evolution takes place. And this is a relatively new theory. It's, from what I've been able to read, taken a fair amount of traction, but it has to do with something I don't understand very well, which is information theory and probability theory. And basically, we have Shannon information theory with coding with genetic codes. For example, if I were to say 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and I did that up to 1,000, the odds of me getting that are exactly the same if I did 10, 12, 1, 7, 4, 3, and did it out to the same number of spaces. The odds of those happening are exactly the same. And so what he says is that there is this sense that evolution seems to be converging on certain properties. And that as you look across the phyla, as you look across the things, it seems that there is an emergence of some sort of structure. And he says that has metaphysical implications. Now, he doesn't say what those are, but when I was reading it, I thought, oh, that's kind of an interesting idea. Like I said, he's an evolutionary paleobiologist from the University of Cambridge, and he has some interesting YouTube things. I read not all, but I read parts of his a significant section, The Crucible of Creation, on the Burgess Shale, which, if you ever want to read something in the rise of animals, is absolutely fascinating story. Well, thank you. Questions? I'm done.
Thank you, Harold. Very, very interesting. I have a brother-in-law that has more of a fundamentalist bent, and actually has a summer school where they try to counter evolution teaching to their students. And,
Mhm.
I've always been very disturbed about that.
Well, you can tell that I am, and again, it's I think it all got back. I was amazed at reading about the trial in the 20s because all of the arguments didn't deal with, is evolution true? They all dealt with, oh my gosh, if evolution is true, then this is true. And I just found that fascinating. That I thought there would be arguments by people who were knowledgeable in evolution and be making arguments, but no, there was, like I said, there were a lot of liberals were opposed to evolution because of eugenics.
Okay, any questions?
I want to thank all of you for coming. What, 6, 7, 8, whatever. Thank you.
We had 8.
Thank you.
Well, and you can count 2 of us on ours, you know. So
Oh yeah,
maybe a
9.
couple too.
Those of us in religion say wherever 2 or 3 are gathered, right? I just hope you found this interesting, because I think this is a conversation we need to have to make sure that we don't fall into some sort of fundamentalist trap, and also we can talk about what is the meaning of evolution and not necessarily have to agree. We can agree on the basis, the description, but it's an interesting conversation to have the prescription. What does it mean? Thank you very much.
Thank you.
All right, that's a wrap.
Okay.
Thank
Bye.
you. Bye.
Thank you. Hey, Ron,
Yes.
Richard, thanks for your help. I appreciate it. Couldn't do it without you.
Yeah. No problem. Thanks.
I need to evolve in my understanding of modern communication.
Yep.
Okay. Bye-bye.